Fulton J. Sheen, God and Intelligence. Continuation of Chapter 11. Is God organic with the world? 2. The identity of essence and the existence in God has already been mentioned. The problem of the relation between God and the world is elucidated mainly by the use of this principle. This principle, which has been called the fundamental truth of Christian philosophy, has been neglected by certain modern philosophers with unfortunate results for theodicy. Its importance may be well seen if we turn to the theodicy of Professor Seth Pringle Pattison. The theory of this learned professor is the most sane proposed in any of the Guilford lectures in recent years. There has been a sincere attempt to escape much of the contemporary misunderstanding and to make God a self-communicating love, and creation an eternal act, which finds itself consummated in the divine sonship of man. Even the incarnation is induced as the full complement of God as self-communicating love, and as the supreme and triumphant reconciliation of immanence and transcendence in God. But at the same time, we have classified the God of his theory under the modern God of becoming. Though we admit that there is less of becoming in it than in the God whose nature is expounded by Professor Alexander. The traditional notion of God, he writes, must be profoundly transformed. But what does this mean? It means that as soon as we begin to treat God and man as two independent facts, we lose our hold upon the experienced fact, which is the existence of the one in the other and through the other. We are here approaching an extremely intimate union of the two, but if God and the world are organic and the world is evolving, then God in some way is evolving. Hence, God is not perfect in the traditional sense. That this interpretation is correct is clear from these words. But if we revise our idea of perfection, if we keep in view the conclusions to which we were led in the two preceding lectures, and definitely abandon the conception of God as a changeless and self-sufficient unit, the movement of the finite and the realization of the infinite to the finite must be taken as the fundamental character of the divine life. Putting this into metaphysical language, we get this conclusion. In the present connection, it may be sufficient to suggest that the transcendence which must be retained and which is intelligible refers to a distinction of value or of quality, not to the ontological separateness of one being from another. It is at this point that the Thomistic metaphysics must break away from any theory which denies ontological separateness of God and the world, or which asserts, as Professor Morgan does, that we are in a measure one with him in substance. The position of St. Thomas, in contrast with this, is that it is metaphysically impossible that God and the universe can be in any way organic, one to the other, or that the only difference which separates them can be one of value or quality. Experience reveals to our intelligence a double principle. First, every effect resembles its cause inasmuch as a cause acts accordingly to its nature. Man resembles man because by generation man acts according to his nature. There is no difficulty on this point. This is the foundation of analogy. But there is yet another aspect which, though often neglected, is no less important. It is this: every effect differs from its cause inasmuch as no cause can communicate its identity. If it could, it would be different from the very same reason that it is the same. which is not possible because the effect does not completely equal the cause. There will be a certain dissimilarity between them. The heat of the sun is possessed by objects of the earth, but not in the same way that the sun possesses it. The cause will always be the reason producing, while the effect will be the reason produced. Hence, in every effect, there is something by which it resembles the cause and something by which it differs from it. In the statue which the sculptor chisels, there will be the idea of Apollo, which is in the artist. But there will also be something which is not in the artist, namely the marble. In creation, the same is true. Metatis metandis. The universe, which is the effect, will be like its cause inasmuch as it will possess a similitude of being. The similarity will not be essential but causal. But the world will also be different from God inasmuch as he draws it out of nothing. As it was in the Creator's power to produce creatures before they existed in themselves, so likewise it is in the Creator's power when they exist, to bring them to nothing. In this way, therefore, by the power of another, namely of God, they are mutable, inasmuch as they are producible from a nothing by him, and are by him reducible from existence to non-existence. Drawn from nothing, they must necessarily be contingent. They will thus always differ in nature from pure being, who made them. Furthermore, at the same time, God gives existence. He gives that which measures existence. The measure of the existence is the essence, which continues its limit as the marble limits that idea of the sculptor. It follows then that the effect will of necessity always be of a different nature from the cause, for the cause can never produce its identity. The only other possibility would be to say that God is the essence or form or matter of all things, as David of Dinant has so foolishly said. But this is impossible because God would then be maker and made, dependent and independent under the same formal consideration, even in the cause of eternal creation. Every creature then necessarily proceeds from God in diversity of nature. Drawn from nothing, it will always be sealed with its mark, being diverse in nature from things. God is forever outside the order of all created things. He will be related to creatures only logically, while creatures will be related to him really, as a science cannot exist without its object. Neither can we exist without God, but as an object can exist without a science, so can God exist without us. God and creature will be diverse in nature. In all things other than God, there are to be found two real elements, the first of which, essence, in relation to the second, existence, is a real potentiality, and the second of which, existence, in relation to the first, essence, is a real act. From the real composition in line intis results formally constituted, being by participation. On the other hand, from the absolute identity of essence and the existence one necessarily concludes to pure act in lena intis, and herein one discovers the true notion of being by essence. Here then is the fundamental reason for the distinction and the separation and the diversity of God and the world. In God, essence and existence are identical. In creatures they are not. There is, therefore, an ontological separateness between God and the world. There is more than a mere difference of value or quality or consciousness. If there were not ontological separateness, and if existence of one were involved in the other, even as Professor Morgan seems to mean in his emergent evolution, then there would be no reason for one being distinct from the other. There would be unity without reason for unity, and distinction without reason for distinction. To make God and the world ontologically one makes both God and the world unintelligible, denies both a reason of being, and asserts the unconditional unity of the diverse, which is a contradiction. There are many other ways in which God and the universe may be related than by denying transcendence in the traditional sense. Furthermore, as the moving thing can never be identified with the mover under the same formal relation, as the composite can never be identified with the simple, neither can the universe be identified with God or made organic with God or evolving with him. Neither can it be said, as Viscount Halinde believes, that man and God are not numerically distinct subjects in knowledge. They are the one foundational mind disclosed itself in different degrees or logical shapes in the progress of reality, but as identical through divergences of form. God and the universe never mix nor fuse, whether to be in a fundamental mind or an organic universe. There can be no identification of being between God and creatures. God and creatures are not diversified by differences added to both, but rather by differences in themselves. Hence, strictly speaking, God and creatures are not different, they are diverse. The diverse is absolute, the different is relative. There is no communication of substance by the act of creation, as the seal does not communicate its substance to the wax in making the impression, so neither does God communicate his substance in making the universe. There is more than a mere quality or value separating the two. Later on, we shall see whether this ontological separateness justifies the modern criticism that on this view God is too aloof from the world's needs. The possibility of an eternal creation does not dispense from the necessity of diversity of nature between God and the universe. When it is said that the world is made from nothing, the temporal or material element does not enter into consideration. It is rather the order of nature, inasmuch as one being depends on another being, considered in itself. The universe has only non-being, since its whole being depends on God. In this sense, whether the world is eternal from the point of view of time does not affect the composition, which will necessarily be in all things made by God. Even though the world were eternal, says St. Thomas, it would still be true to say that it is ex nihilo, because the being which it has depends on God. 3. This brings us to the third modern argument, which maintains that God is organic with the world. It is based on the notion of creation. Here, as elsewhere, we do not propose to give a complete scholastic exposition, but merely to indicate the general lines of solution suggested by modern criticism. The traditional notion of creation meets with general ridicule. Professor Pringle Pattison classes it in the same circle of ideas as the waving of a magician's wand, and by the use of the same magic wand discarded the doctrine as worthy of no place in serious thinking or in genuine religion. James classes it as the product of childish fancy, and as lacking sweep and infinity, enough to meet the requirements of even the illiterate native of India. The vaster vistas which scientific evolutionism has opened, he said, and the rising tide of social democratic ideals has changed the type of our imagination, and the older monarchical theism is obsolete or obsolescent. The place of the divine and the world must be organic and intimate. An external creator and its institutions may still be verbally confessed at church in formal formulas that linger by their mere inertia, but the life is out of them. We avoid dwelling on them. The sincere heart of us is elsewhere. Like other terms in philosophy, creation has changed its meaning. With M. Bergerson, it means novelty. With Howison, it simply means the eternal fact that God is a complete moral agent and that his essence is just a perfect conscience, or else the moral recognition of God by a republic of spirits. For Professor Ward, it means internal limitation, while it assumes almost the meaning of created. With Professor Alexander, God in the sense of the universe, tending towards deity, is creative only of deity. God then, like all other beings in the universe, for space-time itself, is not in the universe, whereas God, since his deity is a part of the universe, is in it, is in the strictest sense not a creator but a creature. I need hardly say that I do not mean that he is a creature of our imagination or of our thought. He is the finite creature of the universe of space-time. Although the term creation has, for these philosophers, lost its old meaning, it has not lost its use. The most generally accepted interpretation of these days, and certainly the sanest, is that of Professor Pringle Pattison. These are the moments when it approaches the traditional notion, and we would often interpret him in that sense were it not for the ridicule he directs against it, thus forbidding such an interpretation. In an effort to escape a false statement of the problem by Janet, namely, that there is a moment when God alone was, and then a next moment when God and the world were. He makes God and the world eternal. We create a difficulty for ourselves, he says, by substantiating God as a solitary unit, apart from the universe, in which he expresses himself. This solitary, anti-mundane figure is a residuum of primitive and pictorial fashion of thinking. Creation must be regarded as an eternal act, an act grounded by the divine nature, and therefore, if we are to use the language of time, coeval with the divine existence, there is no property of the infinite over the finite. Creation is an eternal act or process which must be ultimately understood not as the making of something out of nothing, but as a self-revelation of the divine in and to finite spirits. Apart from individual differences among philosophers, creation ex nihilo is rejected because of a confusion into which they have fallen, and the clarifying of this confusion is the answer to their positive doctrines. The confusion results from spatially imagining creation instead of intelligibly understanding it. Two quite distinct and separate problems are rolled into one. The comprehension of the notion of creation depends on their distinctness. One is a chronological problem, and the other is ontological. The chronological problem is concerned with the time element. The pluralist, along with the Professor Pringle Pattison, insists on the eternal of the universe, there being no priority of the infinite over the finite. As far as reason is concerned, this notion is in perfect accord with St. Thomas. There is no metaphysical necessity for the commencement of the world. Reason alone cannot prove that the world had to have a beginning, nor can it prove that it could not have had a beginning. It cannot be demonstrated that man or heaven or a stone did not always exist. Likewise, neither can it be demonstrated on the part of the efficient cause which acts by the will, for the will of God cannot be investigated by reason. But the divine will can be manifested by revelation, on the which faith rests. Hence, that the world began to exist in an object of faith, but not of demonstration or science. And it is useful to consider this, lest any one presuming to demonstrate what is of faith should bring forward reasons which are not cognate, so as to give occasion to unbelievers to laugh, thinking that on such grounds we believe things that are of faith. So far as reason is concerned, the world need not necessarily have a beginning. Time might go on forever as far as human science is concerned. There might be a kind of eternal flux and flow of universal nature. In this sense, from the point of view of reason, a philosopher may see no reason for denying the eternity of the universe, but thus consider God and the world existing co-eternally. But for the Christians, this conception is untenable. We know by revelation that the world is finite in duration in the past. This is a fact, but an indemonstrable fact. It is a knowledge, but an incommunicable knowledge, as certain as it is incommunicable. It is at this point that the position of Professor Pringle Pattison appears illogical. Throughout his work, there is a splendid attempt to reveal the love of God in communicating himself to us, and a recognition of the incarnation as the sublime reconciliation of transcendent and immanence of God. Scripture is quoted, and Christian thought prevails throughout. But if revelation is worthy of credence, in the case of the incarnation, it is worthy of credence in the case of creation. There seems to be no valid reason for accepting it in one case and denying it in the other. So much for the chronological problem, which is purely accessory. The ontological problem is much more important. Here we prescind from the time element. The problem is now transcendental and not one of duration. Whether the world existed eternally or not does not affect this problem. If it existed eternally, it is eternally insufficient. Neither does that hypothesis of evolution affect the problem in any way, as James and his principles would have us believe. The idea of evolution answers the question of the temporal relation of being one to the other. What temporal bonds are between them? How do they succeed? Are they cause-effect conditions of such and such a kind? The idea of creation refers to something entirely different, as it is the question of the transcendent relation between being as such and its first cause. Evolution is a problem of the before and after. Creation is a problem of the above. Evolution is concerned with relations in a circle. Creation is a tangential problem. Whether being is evolving or not, whether it is perpetual or not, it still must have a source. As it is the most universal effect, it must have the most universal cause. If being is not evolving, but is perpetual, then there must be a source for being. If there is evolution, there is a double reason for the existence of God, because God must be postulated first as the source of being, as such, God Creator. Secondly, as source of being, inasmuch as it is in evolution, God First Mover. And thirdly, as cause of the order according to which the world evolves, that is, intelligibly, which it expresses and the ends which it realizes. God, Word, God Alpha and Omega, God beginning and end. The vaster vistas which scientific evolution has opened in no way affect creation, any more than the invention of machinery affect the necessity of manufacture. The how of process never dispenses with the explanation of why. It does little credit to a philosopher to say that contentment with the progress to a God creator, or some similar notion, is the true mark of speculative indolence. Apart from this, creation has been brought into disrepute among philosophers by their spatial imagining a sort of nothing from which the world is made, and conceiving the creative act as a being, as becoming, or a movement or a change. It is quite true that we often imagine creation as two moments, one in which there was God, and the second in which there was the world. Explaining what he believes to be the traditional notion, a contemporary writes, God is conceived as a pre-existent, self-centered person to whom, in his untroubled eternity, the idea of such a creation occurs, one might almost say, as an afterthought. The inspiration is forthwith put into execution. The world is created by the word of his power. A universe is summoned into existence and stands somewhere there, as shapes and figures might appear at a sorcerer's word of command, or as temples and towers rise like an exhilaration before the eyes of the dreamer. This is a fine example of creation spatially imagined, in which there are two moments of being, and after the two terms, a terminus a quo and a terminus ad quam. Creation is not made up of two moments, one of labor and the next of rest. Creation is not change, it is a relation. St. Thomas, speaking on this point, says, creation is not change, except according to a mode of understanding, for change means that something should be different now from what it was previously. But in creation, by which the whole substance of the thing is produced, the same thing can be taken as different now and before only according to our way of understanding, so that a thing is understood first as not existing at all, and afterwards as existing. But as action and passion coincide as to the substance of motion and differ only according to diverse relations, it must follow that when motion is withdrawn, only diverse relations remain in creator and in the creature. In things which are made without movement, as in creation, to become and to be already made are simultaneous. In these things that which is being made is, but when we speak of its being made, we mean that it is produced by another. Hence, since creation is without movement, a thing is being created, and is already created at the same time. There is then no passage from nothing to being, as if nothing were a stuff or an abyss. First, becoming nothing cannot be the subject of a phenomenon, and secondly, because being nothing, it cannot first be nothing and then something. Creation is intelligible only as a relation, real in us, and logical in God. Creation of the world by God means the world has its reason of being in God. It depends on God in its entirety, which includes the duration, which is its measure. Or more briefly, creation is the dependence of finite being on its first cause. This absolute dependence of created being on God is the evidence of the omnipotent power of God. Power, says St. Thomas, is not to be judged uniquely by what is made, but also by how a thing is made. The greater the heat, the more it heats, and the more quickly it heats. The creation of some finite effect would not show forth the omnipotent power of God, but the creation ex nihilo does. However small a being is, and however finite it is, to create it from nothing requires an infinite power which can belong only to an infinitely perfect being. In creating, there is no addition made to the infinity of God's being, because it is not in the same order as the being of God. Being in an interior order is possible because of the analogy of being. Nor is there any more being in the world after creation than before. Suppose that there was only one man in the world who had knowledge. Knowledge would be quantitatively and qualitatively one in such a case. Now suppose that learned man should teach a populated world. What would be the result? Knowledge would increase quantitatively. Instead of there being one man who knows, there would be millions. But qualitatively, the knowledge would remain the same. There would be no more knowledge qualitatively in the world than before. This comparison is feeble, but it helps to illuminate the point in question. Creation is an increase of being extensively, but not intensively. There are more beings in the world after creation than before, but there is no more being. There are more good things, but the good is not multiplied. Creation introduced the word have into the world to denote participation. Before creation, there was no such thing as having. There was only being. The misunderstanding on this point usually arises from a spatial conception according to which God is understood mathematically. The being of God is not quantitative, it is divine. Being divine, it possesses the fullness of perfection, and nothing can be added to it. What is created is related to the uncreated as a point to a line, there being no proportion between one and the other. A line added to a point does not make it greater, nor does a created good increase the goodness of God. The finite, therefore, being placed outside the infinite as an extensive increase of being, offers no contradiction, and in fact is in perfect accord with the perfection of God, for it allows him causality, without which he would not be perfect. But to place the finite in the infinite, then God is both finite and infinite, and this is not a mystery, as is creation, but the absurd. Neither can it be said that the creative act implies a change in divine will, simply because at a given moment God becomes a creator in time. By his power, God was never a creator in time, because the power is identical with him from all eternity. The divine will is not like our will, which needs external help and other faculties to make it efficacious. There is a change, but the change is in creatures and not in God. Creation is an eternal act which terminates at its object when God wills it. If there is anything new in God, it is only a logical relation, and even that is from our point of view. St. Thomas on this point touches the root of the problem, in saying that the will does not act according to the mode of its being, but according to the mode of its resolution. The divine will embraces not only what the effect will be, but when it will be. A king, for example, decides to make war within a year. When a year comes, the war is carried on without least change in the will of the king, his resolution remaining the same as during the preceding year. There is a change, but the change is wholly on the part of the soldiers. St. Augustine has used another figure to show that the newness of divine effect does not imply newness of action in God. Without any change, the sun illuminates the earth, heats it, nourishes, hardens some things and softens others, dries up others, raises vapors and vegetation, and strengthens the feeble. All the change is on the part of its terminating object. It is not in the nature of the sun. If there is no change in God, there is certainly no necessity that he should create one kind of world more than another. He is not bound to create the best possible world, as Leibniz contended, for otherwise he would lack a sufficient reason. The sufficient reason for an act of the will is to be found, not in the object absolutely considered, but in consideration of the end in view. The present world, then, is the best world possible for the end God had in view in creating it. But if creation depends on the will of God, if it adds no new perfection to God, and if God is not organic with the world, if God for that very reason, static and aloof from the world, needs, it is this question that we shall briefly consider in the next chapter.